Galactic Council ignored Earth's warning. Now the stars burn. The laughter was the part I could not forget. Not the vote, not the dismissal, not the long walk back through corridors of polished black stone that smelled like something ancient and completely indifferent to human concerns. The laughter was what stayed with me, the way a sound sometimes burrows into your memory and refuses to leave no matter how many years pile on top of it. I was standing on the 7th speaking platform of the Grand Chamber at Nexus Prime, holding a data tablet loaded with 12 years of Earth's most careful and most expensive research. 400 pages of trajectory modeling, spectral analysis from 18 deep space monitoring stations, the recorded testimony of 9 scientists who had given the best decades of their adult lives to a single terrifying question. 417 supporting documents cross-referenced and indexed and organized in the clearest possible way, because we had known from the beginning that clarity alone would not be enough, but that we had to try. The amber light of a nearby dying star poured through the enormous curved windows above the chamber floor. It made everything look warm. It made every surface and every face and every ancient, ornate delegate's seat look like it was bathed in something gentle and reassuring. It made everything look like it was going to be fine. It was not going to be fine. My name is Yara Solis. I was 38 years old. I held the rank of commander in Earth's diplomatic corps, and I had spent 6 years building toward a presentation that the Council had decided, through procedural classification, would last 11 minutes. 11 minutes was the speaking allotment for provisional members on matters classified as non-emergency. Our warning about the Volcae had been classified as non-emergency by a subcommittee whose members had never seen the Volcae, and whose meeting to determine the classification had lasted 7 minutes, which meant they had spent 4 fewer minutes deciding whether our warning was important than we would be given to explain why it was. I pressed the activation key and the holographic display bloomed above the chamber floor. A map of the galaxy's inner arm, rendered in cold blue light, precise and detailed and built from 2 decades of observation. Moving through it, slowly and steadily, like an infection spreading through living tissue, was a cluster of deep red. The red represented the Volcae. Behind the red, in every system the swarm had already passed through, there was nothing. Not darkness in the ordinary sense. Not empty space with stars and planets still present but dimmed. Just absence. A complete and permanent absence, as though something had reached into the projection and erased whole suns from the record, leaving behind regions of the galaxy that would never produce light again. Honored delegates, I said. My voice carried well in that chamber. It was designed to carry sound to every corner, every tier, every row of seats occupied by representatives of 43 intelligent species from across the galaxy. What you are seeing is a 20-year recorded observation of a machine civilization we call the Volcae. They are not explorers. They are not migrants searching for a new home. They are not travelers passing through on their way to somewhere else. They move through stellar systems the way a fire moves through dry grass. They consume everything. They extract every usable resource from every planet, every moon, every atmospheric body, every star in a system. When they have finished, the system behind them is not depleted. It is not damaged in a way that might heal over geological time. It is gone, permanently and completely gone. This is not a projection or a theory. It is an observation. We have watched it happen in 14 systems over the course of 20 years, and I have the complete observational record in this presentation. I paused and let the silence do its work. In the front row, Counselor Heth of the Threnody species leaned toward his assistant and said something in a low voice. His assistant covered a sound with one long, graceful hand. The sound was amusement. It was unmistakably, identifiably amusement, not a cough, not a reflexive sound of surprise, but the particular contained sound of a person who has heard something they find somewhat funny. I did not stop. I had prepared for dismissal. Our entire diplomatic team had spent 2 years modeling every possible response and every form of polite disbelief and every kind of procedural deflection that a body like the Council might deploy against an uncomfortable presentation. When you prepare for something long enough, the preparation becomes a kind of armor. You still feel the impact when it arrives. You simply do not fall. The Volkai's current trajectory, I said, keeping my voice level and my pace steady, places them on a direct intercept course with the Lethara system in approximately 15 years. After Lethara, the projected path crosses through the S-Savar system and then through the outer Pelhari colonial territories. We are not speculating about this. The mathematics are clear and they are not complex. I am happy to share the full modeling data with any scientific committee the Council wishes to appoint, and I welcome independent verification. We are asking not just for independent review, we are asking for independent action. Councillor Vale of the Pelhari raised one long, pale hand. Among the Pelhari, raising a hand during a speaking session was a signal for a clarifying question. It was meant to indicate attentiveness. It was meant to be respectful. "Commander Solis," Vale said. The translation device in my ear rendered his voice as smooth and faintly bored, the particular tone of someone managing a meeting that has gone on slightly longer than they believe is necessary. "Your civilization has been engaged in formal astronomical observation for, at most, 300 years. The Threnodi have observed stellar behavior for 11,000 years. The Cathari Collective operates deep space monitoring networks that predate your planet's written language by several thousand years. You are suggesting that your scientists have identified a threat that none of these far more experienced civilizations have managed to detect." "Yes," I said, "because none of those civilizations have been looking in the right direction." Vale laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That almost made it worse. It was the laugh of someone who finds a child's confidence genuinely charming, a brief, warm, entirely dismissive sound that said more clearly than any words could have that the person producing it did not consider what I had just said to be a serious statement from a serious source. I did not stop. I walked through every element of the presentation with the same pace and the same steadiness, because rushing or slowing would have communicated uncertainty, and I had none. I showed the consumption signatures in detail, the specific spectral evidence of stars being drained from the inside rather than burning out naturally, a pattern that matched nothing in any natural stellar database, and that matched the Volkai perfectly in every system where they had operated. I showed the debris fields that followed behind the swarm, composed of materials and in arrangements that no natural process produced. I showed the movement patterns across 2 decades of continuous observation, the steady, purposeful advance that never reversed and never slowed. I showed the projected timeline of the swarm's advance across the next 50 years. I showed 3 colony systems, each one populated by living people who were going about their daily existence right now, without any knowledge of the red cluster, moving toward them on my holographic display. When I finished, the chamber moved with practiced efficiency to the vote on Resolution 7 Gamma, which proposed filing Earth's warning as a speculative concern pending review by a subcommittee that would convene at the next centennial session. 100 years. They were proposing to revisit the question in 100 years. 38 delegates voted in favor of filing and waiting. 5 voted against. The 5 were the smallest, newest member species on the Council, the ones who still remembered because it had not been long enough for them to forget what it felt like to present something important to a room that had already decided not to listen. I did not speak again after the vote. There is nothing useful to say to a room that has already made its decision and feels entirely comfortable with it. I gathered my tablet. I walked down from the speaking platform. I crossed the chamber floor past dozens of delegates who were already gathering their own materials and moving on to the next item on the day's schedule. I went through the great chamber doors into the corridor beyond, and the sound of the doors closing behind me was the loudest sound I had heard all day. My deputy, a steady and precise man named Owen Clark, was waiting in the shuttle bay. He had 2 cups of something warm and a face that told me everything he was too polite to say. He handed me a cup without speaking. We stood together and looked out through the wide viewport at the stars, distributed across the dark in patterns that did not care at all about what had just happened in the room behind us. "They filed it," Owen said after a long moment. "They filed it." He wrapped both hands around his cup. Owen did this when he was thinking carefully about what to say next, and he always took the time he needed. "What do we do now?" I thought about the laughter. I thought about Counselor Vale's warm, brief, dismissive amusement. I thought about 15 years, and a system called Lethara, and the people who lived there right now, going about their ordinary lives without knowing that they had just been mentioned in a chamber where 38 intelligent species had considered their future, and decided it was not urgent enough to act on today. "We go home," I said, "and we get to work." I recorded one line in my personal log on the journey back to Earth. Just one line, because I did not have more than one line in me at that moment. I have read it many times in the years since, in the difficult periods when the work was very costly, and the cost was very hard to look at directly. The line was, "They had a chance, we gave it to them." On the final approach to Earth, I sat at the transport window and watched the planet come up slowly in the view, blue and white and green, turning with the same patient indifference to human drama that it had maintained for 4.5 billion years. I pressed my palm flat against the cool glass and held it there for a long time. We were not going to let it end here. That was the decision. I made it looking at the planet from that window, and I never unmade it, not once, in all the years that followed. Owen and I did not spend a single hour believing the Council would reverse its position. We had worked in galactic diplomacy long enough to understand exactly how large, ancient, comfortable institutions behave when presented with inconvenient data from a species they have not yet decided to take fully seriously. They do not change direction because the data is correct. They change direction when the consequences of ignoring the data become impossible to continue ignoring. The problem was that by the time those consequences became impossible for the Council to ignore, the living people of Lethara would already be dead. So we did something that no Earth diplomatic team had ever formally done before, because it had never been necessary before, and because doing it crossed a line that none of us crossed without understanding exactly what we were choosing. We stopped asking for help. We started preparing to act without it. Admiral Louise Hartley ran Earth's Deep Space Defense Division from a command station positioned above the Pacific Ocean, and she had been quietly reviewing our presentation files before we even returned from Nexus Prime. She was a compact woman in her early 60s with close-cut gray hair and the particular economy of speech that comes from spending decades thinking very clearly about very difficult problems. She did not use extra words. She did not produce extra words, because every time she considered adding one she apparently concluded it was not earning its place. She contacted me 3 weeks after our return. "You believe they will come," she said. It was not a question in any meaningful sense. "I know they will come," I said. "Then we build what we need, now, before they arrive, because we cannot wait for anyone else to decide to build it for us." That conversation lasted 22 minutes by the ship's log. By the end of it, I had a new assignment, a new title, and a new category of work that was not diplomatic in any respect. That evening I told Owen, who listened to every word without interrupting, and then asked 2 precise questions about resource allocation, and then nodded and said he would begin making the necessary arrangements starting in the morning. The next 12 years were the strangest and most purposeful years of my life. There is a particular kind of work that becomes possible when you know exactly what the work is for, and when the work is genuinely necessary, and when the people doing it with you understand both of those things completely. The research teams and the engineering teams and the crew training programs all had that quality. Everyone working within them knew what they were building toward, and knowing made them very effective. Earth's scientific community threw itself at the problem of the Volcae with the focused intensity that comes from clear-eyed, deliberate fear. I want to be precise about what I mean by that, because fear takes many forms and they are not equivalent. This was not the panic that scatters people in different directions. This was not the dread that paralyzes. This was the clean, specific fear of people who look at something genuinely dangerous and decide, as a conscious act, that understanding it completely is the only acceptable response to it. The Volcae were machines, but calling them that the way you might call a simple tool a machine misses almost everything important about what they were. They were a civilization. At some distant point in their history, they had made the transition from biological to mechanical existence and had built everything they subsequently became on that foundation. They communicated through distributed signal resonance, a system in which billions of individual units shared a collective awareness spread across vast regions of space. There was no central command structure, no single point of intelligence that could be targeted, no leadership to negotiate with or to threaten into changing course. The swarm was the mind, and the mind was distributed so widely that no single point within it was essential to the whole. This was why every conventional approach to the Volcae had failed. A weapon could destroy individual units. Multiple council species had tried this in the early years of contact with the swarm, before the full nature of the Volcae was understood. The results were always the same regardless of what weapon was used or how many units were destroyed. Attacking individual units of the Volcae was like trying to stop a river by throwing stones into it. The water moved around the obstruction. The swarm moved around the losses. It repaired itself. It replicated the destroyed units, and the advance continued exactly as before. Our researchers took a different approach, working from debris fields that the Council had catalogued and then filed as residual radiation and never examined again. They spent nearly a decade studying the precise signal frequencies and patterns through which the Volcae's distributed network maintained its coherence. The patterns were extraordinarily complex. They were also, once you understood the underlying principles, patterns, and patterns can be analyzed. And what can be analyzed can eventually be interrupted. Dr. Neil Farrow ran our primary research station on Titan, where the distance from Earth's populated areas provided both safety for certain kinds of experiments and a useful separation from the institutional pressures that inevitably accumulate around any sufficiently important project. Neil was tall and slightly distracted in the manner of people whose minds are typically somewhere several steps ahead of the current conversation. He thought better with printed data sheets in his hands than with holographic displays, for reasons he had never successfully explained and had eventually stopped trying to. He had a habit of rubbing the back of his neck when he was about to say something important, and after enough calls, I had learned to watch for it. He was rubbing his neck on the Thursday afternoon in the 9th year when he called me. "We have something that works," he said. "Show me everything." He held up a data sheet dense with equations and annotated with handwritten notes in several colors of ink. "We are calling it a resonance disruptor. The concept, when you arrive at it, is straightforward. Getting to the concept took 9 years and came very close to breaking 4 of my best people in the process, and I want that in the record." He set the sheet down. "The Volcae network functions like a brain. A vast, distributed machine brain spread across volumes of space, rather than contained in a skull. You cannot destroy it unit by unit any more than you could stop a human from thinking by removing individual neurons one at a time. The units are individually replaceable, and the network compensates for each loss automatically. But you can destabilize a brain without destroying its individual components. You can disrupt the coherence of the signal patterns that hold all those distributed units in communication with each other. When the coherence breaks down across a large enough volume, The swarm units in that volume cannot hear the rest of the network. They cannot coordinate with each other. They cannot function as a single mind. They go dark, not destroyed, not permanently damaged, offline, disconnected from themselves and from the rest of the swarm for as long as the disruption is maintained. How large a volume can you disrupt with the current system? He rubbed the back of his neck once more. Current prototype covers approximately the volume of a small moon. We are continuing to work on scaling, and the theoretical limits are significantly larger than what we have built so far. I sat with that for a moment. A small moon. The Volocai clusters that appeared in our worst-case projections were significantly larger than a small moon, but a small moon was a real, measurable, achievable thing, a beginning that could be built upon. Build everything you have, I said, then build more than you think you will need, and get me a timeline for scaling to the next level. Neil went back to his data sheets, and I went back to mine, and the pace of everything accelerated. The ship came 6 months after that call. Earth's Admiralty had been designing her for years in a classified construction facility above the lunar surface. Louise Hartley walked me through the facility on a cold, clear morning with Earth hanging in the viewport overhead, blue and white and steady, and she brought me to the bay where the vessel that her engineers had built was being finished, and she stopped and pointed. "Her name is Adamant," Louise said. The Adamant was not the largest ship Earth had ever constructed. She was not the most conventionally powerful in any standard military sense. She had been designed from the first draft around the resonance disruptor array, every structural decision and every system made in service of that central capability. The array was the point of the ship. Everything else existed to carry it, power it, protect it, and put it where it needed to be. She carried a crew of 412 people. Before I ever set foot on her deck, I read every personnel file in her roster. I wanted to know their names before I knew anything else about them. Owen Clark became my first officer, because there was no other reasonable choice, and he did not require any persuasion. He accepted with the quiet practicality he brought to everything that mattered to him. Within a week, he had produced a complete crew analysis, a logistics gap assessment organized by priority, and a detailed training schedule laid out across the following 18 months, all formatted in the clean, legible way he formatted everything, because he believed that clear documents produced clear thinking and sloppy documents produced sloppy thinking. Diane Foster was our weapons chief. She was calm in the particular way that certain capable people are calm, not because nothing troubled her, but because she had decided long ago not to let external conditions determine her internal state. She spent 16 months learning the disruptor array until she could run every diagnostic, every calibration procedure, and every emergency protocol from memory without reference to documentation. Then she built a team who could do the same, and she held that team to the same standard she held herself, and the team rose to meet it. Our communications officer was a young lieutenant named Clara Webb, who had a quality that becomes increasingly rare in people as they gain experience and authority, the ability to deliver accurate information clearly, and without softening it past the point where it remained accurate. She told you what was true. She did not tell you a version of what was true that she thought you would find easier to receive. We trained hard and we trained long. Every conceivable scenario, and several that required imagination to construct, because nothing in our operational history had produced them yet. We were still in training cycles when the spectral alert arrived from the monitoring station at the edge of the Lethara system. Not a distress message. The people of Lethara did not know anything was wrong yet. It was just a change in stellar readings, a shift in Lethara's sun's spectral output that matched, with terrible precision, the consumption signature we had spent years studying in archived data from systems the Volocai had already passed through. Lethara's sun had begun to dim. I was on the bridge of the Adamant when the reading came in. The bridge went quiet in the particular way that a space goes quiet when something enormous enters it without warning. Clara had the alert on her console, and she looked at it for exactly 2 seconds before routing it to my display. And in those 2 seconds, her expression told me everything I needed to know before I read a single number. "Send a priority Sigma alert to the Galactic Council," I said. My voice was steady. I had been practicing for this moment without knowing I was practicing for it for 12 years. Full data package, current Lethara system status, updated trajectory projections, the complete current observational record, everything. "Sending," Clara said. The Council's automated response arrived in 4 hours. I read it aloud to Owen, because some things need to pass through the air before they can be fully real. Incident logged. Emergency session scheduled in 90 days. 90 days. 3 more systems sat within the Volkai's next projected approach corridor beyond Lethara. In 90 days, based on the swarm's current movement rate, 2 of those systems would be in serious and immediate danger. Owen looked at the message and then at me. He did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that we did not both already know. I closed the response file and opened the fleet status display. 14 ships, 12 with fully operational disruptor arrays installed and tested, 2 carrying spare components and additional research support teams. Thousands of crew across the fleet, every one of them briefed completely on the mission and what it might require of them, every one of them present by deliberate choice. "Draft 1 message to the Council," I said. "A courtesy communication. Inform them that Earth's fleet is proceeding into Volkai-contested space to engage the advancing swarm. Inform them they are welcome to follow if they choose to do so." Owen drafted it himself, without delegating, quickly, in the way he did things when he agreed with them completely and wanted to make sure they were done right. We did not wait for a reply. The Adamant and her fleet were already moving when the reply arrived, and by the time anyone at Nexus Prime thought to send a follow-up message asking for clarification, we were 3 days into a 9-day journey that only went in one direction. I spent those 9 days walking the ship, eating in the crew mess with different groups so that no one felt invisible, reviewing engagement scenarios with Owen and Diane and the tactical team, until we had run through every version we could construct and had begun improvising beyond what the scenarios could provide. I slept 6 hours each night, and I was strict about it, because an exhausted commander makes poor decisions at precisely the moments when good decisions are most urgently needed, and I had no intention of being the reason we failed when we got to where we were going. On the 9th day, the Volkai advance front appeared on our sensors. Nothing in our simulations had prepared me for what the swarm looked like in full. Not because our data had been wrong, it had been correct in every measurable way, but because there is a difference between understanding something from data and encountering it in 3 dimensions at close range. The Volkai swarm did not look like machinery. It looked like a cloud. A vast, slowly shifting, impossibly complex cloud of individual units, each one roughly the size of a ground vehicle, moving in patterns so intricate and so perfectly coordinated that from a distance they appeared almost like something biological, something that had grown naturally rather than been built. From very far away it could have been a nebula, something ancient and mindless and natural. Up close, the sense of purpose in the movement was impossible to miss. This was not drift. This was not random motion. This was coordinated intent operating at a scale that was genuinely difficult to hold in the mind all at once. "All ships hold formation," I said into the fleet-wide channel. "Weapons. Prepare the disruptor array for primary discharge sequence. I want full calibration confirmation before we proceed." Diane ran through the checklist with the steady, precise voice of someone who has rehearsed something so many times that the performance and the rehearsal have become identical. Each confirmation came back clean. The array was ready. The targeting was locked on the leading cluster of the advance, a mass of Voakai units that our sensors estimated at roughly the volume of a small moon. Range to primary target. 400,000 kilometers, Diane said. Fire. From inside the ship, the discharge was strangely quiet. A low vibration moved through the hull, felt more than heard, like a sound too low to register as sound. The power systems dimmed for 3 seconds in a way that was expected and accounted for in the engineering. Then everything returned to normal readings, and the bridge was very still. Outside, in the leading cluster of the Voakai advance, the effect was not quiet. The cluster went still, not destroyed, not scattered, not driven back. Still, in the way a crowd of thousands of people goes completely silent the instant they all hear the same enormous, unexpected sound. The constant micro-movements that were the visible signature of the swarm's distributed coordination simply stopped. Every unit in the cluster stopped at once. 400,000 individual machine components, each one a piece of a distributed mind that had never before encountered anything capable of reaching it this way, all of them offline simultaneously. The engagement lasted 47 minutes because the swarm did not accept the disruption as a final condition. Adjacent clusters that had not been targeted began moving toward the affected area, pushing new units forward to reestablish the network coherence that the disruptor had broken. We fired again. We fired again after the recharge cycle completed. Diane's team ran the array through its sequence with a focus that I could feel from my position across the bridge. 2 of our frigates took significant impacts from swarm units that moved faster than our approach models had predicted. We lost crew. I did not ask for the exact count during the engagement because the engagement required my complete attention. I would learn the count afterward, and the names along with it. When the last cluster in the advance group went dark and drifted silent, the bridge held its silence for a long time. Owen exhaled, a slow, controlled exhale, the kind that contained something much larger than the breath itself. That worked. Did you doubt it? He considered the question honestly. No, but there is a real difference between knowing a thing will work and watching it work. Those are not the same experience. He was right, they are not the same experience. I did not go to my desk or file a report or update any log before I went to the medical bay. There are proper orders of priority for what comes after an engagement, and the people who had been hurt and the people we had lost were the first item on that list. Above all the documentation and all the communication and all the tactical analysis. I spent an hour in the medical bay. Then I went to my quarters and I said the names of the 12 people we had lost that day into the ship's personal log, each name in full, with their home city and their role aboard the ship, without hurrying through any of them. 12 names on the first day. 6 weeks after the engagement, 3 Council observation ships arrived at the edge of our operational zone and took up positions at a careful distance, their sensor arrays oriented toward the dark and silent Voakai cluster. They did not hail us. They did not offer anything. They simply observed. I let them observe for as long as they needed. I understood exactly what they were doing. They were deciding whether what their sensors described matched reality. They were deciding whether a young species with a provisional seat at the Galactic table had actually accomplished what the readings suggested. I had no interest in hurrying that decision. I had learned a great deal in 12 years about waiting, and this particular kind of waiting did not cost us anything. One line in my personal log that night, the same way it had begun at Nexus Prime. Now they are watching. Good, let them see what they chose to miss. The galaxy watched for 6 months before anyone spoke. We did not stop moving while we waited. We pushed across the advance front, working system by system, cluster by cluster, with the methodical and sustained focus of people who understand clearly what they are working toward, and why every hour of delay has a specific and measurable cost attached to it. The front was too wide for our 14 ships to cover completely, and every day Owen updated our positioning models as new sensor data arrived. calculating which systems were in most immediate danger and how quickly we could reach each one. It was a problem that had no clean solution, only better and worse trade-offs, and Owen worked it with the same patient precision he brought to every problem that had no clean solution. Neil Farrow's team on Titan worked in parallel without pause, refining the disruptor array based on the operational data we sent them after every engagement. Each update they sent improved the system's performance in some measurable way, and we installed each update in the field between engagements. Neil called me every 2 weeks to brief me personally on progress and problems. He rubbed the back of his neck at least once per call, and I had learned to calibrate the importance of what was coming by how early in the call the rubbing started. The first response from a council species arrived at the end of the 6th month. It came from Myra Penn of the Selhari, who had been one of the 5 votes against Resolution 7 Gamma 12 years earlier. She was tall and angular, with an unexpressive face that somehow communicated, through the precise arrangement of her posture, an impression of complete and unhurried sincerity. "Commander Solis," she said, "my government has authorized me to offer material support to your fleet. Fuel reserves, repair components, medical supplies. We cannot offer combat vessels at this time. Our defense forces are not equipped or trained to engage the Volkai effectively, but we can keep your ships operational." "I accept," I said immediately, "formally and personally both." "You warned the council," she said. "We listened. Not everyone chose to." She closed the channel. Within 2 weeks, a Selhari supply convoy arrived at our forward resupply point, and the fuel situation across 3 of our ships moved from the category of concerning to the category of manageable. Small changes matter across long operations in ways that do not become fully apparent until you are deep enough in to feel the difference between barely enough and sufficient. The Davin sent medical personnel shortly after, 12 of them, highly trained and immediately useful. The Orath contributed a network of long-range sensor platforms that improved our advance warning capability significantly. Neither sent combat ships. They were not ready for that, and I did not push. We took what was offered, incorporated it fully, and continued moving. We were not alone anymore, but we were still the ones holding the line. I stood again on the 7th speaking platform of the Grand Chamber at Nexus Prime. The amber light from the dying star came through the curved windows exactly as it had 12 years before. The chamber's geometry was identical. The architecture had not changed. Everything that was made of stone and glass and metal was exactly where it had been. The chamber was nothing like what it had been. 41 of the seats occupied during my first presentation were empty. The Lethara delegation did not exist anymore because Lethara did not exist anymore. The S-Savar representatives were gone for the same reason. Several Pelhari junior delegates who had attended my first presentation as observers, sitting in the back rows and paying the kind of attention you pay to something you expect to be briefly interesting, had been stationed at outer colony positions that the Volkai reached before we could. Empty chairs carry a weight that filled chairs do not, and the chamber was dense with that weight, and no one inside it could ignore it or pretend it was not there. I had 2 pages of handwritten notes in my jacket pocket. I did not reach for them. "Honored delegates," I said. The chamber had gone quiet before I started and stayed quiet in a way that was different from any quiet it had produced in my experience of it. There was no murmuring. There was no quiet side conversation. There was no sound of the kind that signals polite attention being managed in parallel with private thoughts about other matters. There was attention. Complete and undivided attention. I'm not here to present data. You have the data, your own monitoring networks and your own scientific teams, and 6 years of direct observation of our fleet's operations have given you every piece of data that exists on the subject of the Volkai and what can be done about them. You know what they are. You know what happens to a living system when they pass through it. You know now what happens when they are met with something capable of stopping them. I waited a moment. Earth has developed the only technology that is currently capable of disrupting the Volkai's operation. We have the tactical doctrine and the trained crews and the operational record across 5 years of active engagement. What we do not have is sufficient capacity to hold a front this large indefinitely while operating alone. We have held it. We can continue to hold it. But the cost of holding it alone grows every year, and that cost is not measured in abstract figures or in projections. It is measured in the names in a notebook. I reached into my jacket and produced a small, worn notebook. I set it on the surface of the speaking platform. That notebook belongs to my first officer, Commander Owen Clark. He has updated it after every single engagement since our first operation near Lethara. It contains the full name of every person Earth has lost since we began this work. I asked his permission to bring it here today. He gave it without hesitation, and he asked me to tell you that he keeps it because he believes a name remembered is the minimum that person is owed. The chamber was completely still. Earth is prepared to share the resonance disruptor technology in its entirety, the full engineering specifications, the complete tactical framework, the crew training program, everything we have developed, openly shared, so that the allied species of this council can build their own capability and stand with us on the front. In return, Earth asks for 3 specific things: full membership in the Galactic Council with equal voting rights on all matters, and operational command of the Unified Defense Force for the duration of the conflict, under joint oversight from a panel of senior delegates chosen by the Council. These are not demands born from arrogance. They are conditions born from the understanding that the structure of the effort must match the scale of the problem. Councillor Heth of the Threnody, who had provided the conditions for laughter 12 years ago in this chamber, was sitting forward with both forearms flat on his desk surface. His expression did not give me anything I could read precisely, but he was giving me his complete and uninterrupted attention, which was something he had not done during my first presentation. "These are significant terms," he said. "They reflect a significant situation," I said. "The situation we are in did not need to be what it is. It became what it is through a series of choices made in this room and in others like it. I am not here to assign blame for those choices. I am here to describe what is now required to address the situation those choices produced." Delegate Kara of the Cathari Collective raised her hand. She was the most capable political analyst in the council, and she knew it, and she used that capability with the efficiency of someone who understands exactly what their tools are for. Operational command of a multi-species force requires more than demonstrated military effectiveness, she said. You have shown that Earth can fight the Volkai. Leading an alliance of 43 species in sustained, coordinated operations requires capacities that are not the same as fighting capacity. You are correct, I said, which is precisely why the proposal includes joint oversight. We are not asking for unchecked authority. We are asking to lead the defense. There is a meaningful and important difference between leading and ruling. And if this council declines your terms? I looked at Delegate Kara directly. I had thought about this question for weeks, and I had decided that the only acceptable answer was the true one. Then Earth continues as it has been doing, alone, with the resources we have. The front continues to cost us what it has been costing. The Volkai continues to advance into systems that fall outside our coverage because we cannot be everywhere at once with 14 ships, and the casualties that result from that insufficiency are real people with real names. I paused. 3 weeks ago, our research team delivered an updated intelligence projection. Based on the current movement rate of the Volkai and the current distribution of our fleet, a Cathari Outer Research Station designated KR-7 falls outside our operational coverage zone. I have been considering how and when to share this information. I have decided that this is the appropriate moment. Delegate Kara held very still. How long does KR-7 have? If the advance continues at its current measured rate, approximately 14 months before it falls within the Volkai's operational approach range. The silence that followed this was unlike anything I had heard that chamber produce before. It was the silence of 41 species understanding simultaneously, and without the possibility of comfortable doubt, that the distance between the problem and their own concerns had just become zero. Myra Penn of the Selhari raised her hand. Her voice was completely steady. I move that we proceed immediately to a vote on the Terran Accord as presented by Commander Solis. I move that we dispense with any further procedural delay. There were no procedural objections. In a chamber that had operated on procedural habit for centuries, where objections were raised reflexively as a matter of institutional custom, there were no objections. The absence of that reflex was itself a statement. Everyone in the chamber understood what it meant. The Terran Accord passed 41-2. The 2 votes against came from species whose home systems sat at distances from the current front that had allowed them to maintain the comfortable belief that they were not directly affected. I understood those votes. I did not respect them, but I understood the thinking behind them, and I filed the understanding away, because understanding the thinking of people who are not yet ready to act is useful information when the moment comes that they need to be ready. The signing was held in a small room adjacent to the main chamber. A table, the document on tablets, one authorized representative from each signatory species. I had asked specifically for no ceremony and no speeches. The Council honored both requests. Documents that matter do not require decoration to matter. They matter because of what they commit to. When the last mark was entered, Secretary General Vorath looked at the completed record and then at me, and said the title that the Accord's operational provisions had established. Admiral Solis, do you have anything to say for the record? I thought about Owen's notebook on the speaking platform. I thought about 12 names said aloud in a quiet cabin on the first night of the war. I thought about the thousands of names that had followed those 12, in Owen's handwriting, in a notebook that had grown considerably heavier over 5 years. I thought about Louise Hartley and Patrick Hale and Diane Foster and Neil Farrow and Clara Webb, and every person across the fleet who had given what they gave to get to this moment. No, I said, let's get to work. Patrick Hale, who commanded the frigate Kelso, was one of the officers I watched most closely during the early months of the Accord. He had a habit of pushing to the absolute edge, and in our solo operations this had mostly worked. In a coalition, it created friction. His aggressive positioning during a third-month engagement drew Allied ships into an unplanned maneuver, and the Orath commander whose vessel was affected filed a formal protest with the Joint Oversight Panel. I met with Hale privately the next morning. He sat across my desk with the stillness of someone who understands they have done something wrong and is waiting to hear how wrong. I moved without signaling, he said before I could begin. You moved without signaling, and 3 Allied ships followed you because they had no choice, and the engagement plan for that sector came apart. The Allied crews do not know you the way our own fleet knows you. They follow the plan because the plan is the only shared language we currently have. Every time an Earth officer acts outside that language without warning, it damages something that takes months to rebuild. He nodded without making excuses. That told me he understood. You are one of the best tactical officers I have, I said. I need that capability inside the coalition structure, not running ahead of it. He did not repeat the mistake. Over the following year, he became one of the most sought-after tactical partners among the Allied commanders, because he learned to share his instincts before acting on them, and the Allied crews discovered that his instincts were almost always correct. By the 3rd year of the Accord, Orath commanders were specifically requesting to operate in formation with the Kelso. The protest that Delegate Kara's colleagues had filed was, by then, something nobody mentioned. There was also the slower, more careful matter of Cathari integration. Delegate Kara had voted for the Accord, but her people's full participation in the Allied force was more deliberate than almost any other species. They sent observers to 3 full months of operations before deploying a single combat vessel. Their observers filed detailed, precise reports and asked extremely specific questions, and I answered every one of them completely, because Cathari precision is not obstruction. It is the way they build confidence, and confidence built at that pace holds under pressure in ways that faster-built confidence sometimes does not. When the first Cathari combat ship joined our operational line, its crew had reviewed more tactical data than any Allied crew before them. They performed above expectations from the first engagement. Delegate Kara sent me a brief message afterward. It said, "We learn carefully so that we perform well. I hope you understand this about us." I wrote back, "I do now, and I meant it in more ways than one." The months accumulated into years, and the years brought a shift that I had hoped for but not entirely believed was achievable. The Allied species stopped fighting alongside us and started fighting with us, and the difference between those two states is not a matter of degree but of kind. Alongside means parallel effort toward a shared goal, each party moving in the same direction. With means shared instinct, shared timing, the ability to anticipate what the ship beside you will do before they signal it, the trust that goes all the way down to the level of action rather than stopping at the level of agreement. You cannot create that state by policy or by directive. You can only create the conditions in which it might develop, and then you do the work, and eventually the trust becomes real because it has been tested enough times to know itself. By the 4th year of the Accord, we had it. Neil Farrow sent us the most significant upgrade to the disruptor technology in the 4th year as well, a modification that extended effective discharge range by 40% and reduced recharge intervals by nearly a third. He called me himself to deliver the news. He was not rubbing his neck. He was, for the first time in my experience of him, simply smiling. "We are running out of ways to improve it significantly," he said. "That is not a complaint," I said. "No," he agreed. "It means we are close to the end." We were. The front contracted over those years in a way that was visible on the strategic maps as a slow but unmistakable retreat of the red. The Volkai did not acknowledge defeat in any communicable way. They did not signal, did not negotiate, did not change their behavior in any fashion that suggested they understood the concept of losing. They simply stopped advancing, and then they began withdrawing, cluster by cluster, system by system, back along the paths of their own advance. Whether this represented a decision made somewhere in the distributed mind of the swarm, or simply a mechanical response to the disruption of their coordination, we never determined. Possibly there is no difference for a mind like theirs. What I know is that the maps changed. The red pulled back. The systems behind it did not recover because consumed systems do not recover. But the systems ahead of it were still there, still inhabited, still full of living people who did not know how close the boundary had come to them. I looked at those maps every morning during the final year of the campaign. Every morning the boundary had moved, and every morning I thought about the version of events in which we had not acted, in which we had accepted the Council's filing of our warning and waited for the Centennial Review, and I let myself understand, briefly and completely, the difference between that version and the one I was living in. Then I put the thought away and went back to work, because the work was not finished yet, and understanding the alternative is not the same as being finished. 7 years. That is how long it took from the day the Terran Accord was signed to the evening. I sat in the command chair of the fleet flagship and watched the display screen show me the last major Volkai cluster going dark and staying dark. 7 years that were not simply a continuation of what had come before, because the Accord changed the nature of the effort fundamentally. Before the Accord, we were a single species operating alone on the far edge of what 14 ships could accomplish. After the Accord, we were the leading element of a coalition that grew over the first 2 years from a handful of tentative participants to a functioning Allied force representing 19 species, with operational units from 11 of them directly integrated into the frontline campaign structure. Building that coalition was a different kind of difficulty from fighting the Volcae. With the Volcae, the problem was clear, and the solution, once we had it, was technically demanding but conceptually straightforward. With the coalition, the problems were all of the kind that have no technically demanding solution, only patient, careful, sustained human work. And by human, I mean the kind of work that living, thinking beings who care about their own dignity and their own ways of doing things must do when they decide to operate together despite those differences. Different species brought different assumptions about command, about how decisions should be made, how dissent should be expressed, how credit should be allocated, how mistakes should be acknowledged. None of those assumptions were simply wrong. They were different in ways that created friction when they met each other unexpectedly, and the work of leadership was to anticipate those frictions before they became problems, to create the structures that let 41 different ways of being excellent operate together, without any of them having to pretend they were something they were not. Owen was better at this than I was. He always had been. He had an instinct for the personal dimension of organizational work, for knowing when someone needed to be heard rather than directed, for recognizing the specific kind of reassurance that restores a person's confidence before a difficult operation without ever explicitly addressing the confidence problem. He could walk into a room full of tension and leave it with the tension resolved without anyone being entirely sure what had changed. I relied on him more heavily during the Accord years than at any previous point in our working relationship. I do not think he minded. I think he understood that it was the right use of what he was good at. Louise Hartley died in the 5th year of the Accord. It was not the Volcae that killed her. It was an illness that had been progressing in the background of all those years of work, quiet and patient, and entirely indifferent to how important the work was. She had known about it for 8 months before she told me, because she had judged, correctly, that telling me earlier would have affected my ability to make decisions that needed to be made without that weight on them. I was angry with her for this when she told me, in the controlled and specific way that I am angry when I am genuinely upset and cannot afford to show how much. She found my anger somewhat funny, in the gentle way that people who are approaching the end of things find certain kinds of ordinary human reactions funny. We sat together in her office that afternoon for 2 hours, and she was calm and I was not, and she let me be what I was without trying to manage it, and that was one of the most generous things anyone has ever done for me. I named a ship after her when she was gone. She had told me explicitly and more than once not to do this. I named it after her anyway, and the Louise Hartley served with distinction for the remaining 2 years of the Accord campaign, and her crew held their position in every engagement they were part of, and I believe Louise would have approved of both the nomming and the crew even while she insisted, as she certainly would have, that the gesture was unnecessary. Patrick Hale, the young captain I had once ordered back to the repair line during an engagement, was by the 4th year of the Accord one of the 3 most capable tactical commanders in the entire Allied fleet. Age and sustained operational experience had done for him what they reliably do for people who are genuinely capable, which is to replace confidence in themselves with confidence in the work. He thought less about what he could do and more about what needed to be done. And the difference between those 2 orientations is the difference between a good officer and an excellent one. Diane Foster ran our weapons division for the full 7 years of the Accord, and refused both opportunities I gave her to rotate to a different role. She built a crew training program for Allied species weapons teams that became the operational standard across the entire coalition. She was also, by the 5th year, training the trainers, which meant her approach to the technical and tactical dimensions of disruptor operation was being transmitted through several layers of instruction to crews she would never directly meet. Clara Webb was promoted 3 times. She brought the same quality to each new level of responsibility. She told you what was true. She did not decide in advance how much of the truth you could manage and adjust accordingly. She trusted you with the full information, which is the kind of trust that is actually respectful rather than just comfortable. These are a few of them. I want to be clear that they are only a few, because the story of the Accord was carried by thousands of people across 19 species and 41 ships and dozens of support operations, and any version of that story told through a single narrator's perspective is necessarily partial. I knew the people I worked closest to. I did not know everyone who made the work possible. I want the record to say clearly that I understand this. The Volkai did adapt in the 4th year. Their responses to disruptor discharges began to show signs of adjustment, faster reorganization around disrupted clusters, changes in unit spacing that reduced the effective coverage area of each discharge. Neil Farrow's team responded to each adaptation with counter-adaptations, and the technical competition between our weapon and their response became an ongoing dynamic that defined the operational character of the Accord's middle years. It was, in a strange way, the most intellectually intense period of the entire conflict, a real-time problem-solving competition conducted at the cost of enormous effort and significant casualties. We held the advantage throughout, not by a comfortable margin and not without cost, but we held it. The final engagement was fought over a system the Volkai had consumed in an earlier pass, before we had stopped their advance. It was a dead system now, a cold iron star in empty space, the kind of permanent absence that you learned to look at without flinching only after you had looked at it many times. The last major swarm cluster had retreated there after we pushed them back from 6 approach vectors over 8 months of sustained coordinated operations across the Allied fleet. They had not developed a strategy for retreat because they had never needed one before us, and the absence of that strategy was visible in the way they gathered. They were not preparing a counteroffensive. They were not reorganizing for a different approach. They were simply in the only space that was already empty, because empty space was the only space they knew what to do with. We surrounded them with 40 ships, 20 Earth-built, 20 built by allied species to our specifications, crewed by people who had trained alongside our people for years, and who had become, in the particular way that shared difficulty creates real bonds between people who were previously strangers, something genuinely close to family. The Louise Hartley held the center position. I gave the order without ceremony. Fire! 40 disruptor arrays discharged in coordinated sequence across the fleet. The last major Volkai cluster went still and dark. No movement, no recoordination, no response of any kind. My bridge held its silence for a long time. Clara Webb looked at her console with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It took me a moment to identify it correctly, because I was looking for something recognizable as relief, and what I saw was something larger and quieter than relief. Something that had moved past the feeling of a burden being lifted into the state of a person who has carried something for so long that they have forgotten what it felt like before the weight was there, and is now discovering that again from the inside. Owen closed his notebook. He put it in his jacket pocket, and he did not take it out again for the rest of that day, and I did not see him open it again for a long time after that. I did not feel what I had expected to feel. During the difficult years, I had imagined the end arriving with some quality of resolution, like a piece of music reaching the note it has been moving toward through all the preceding notes, and when it arrived everything around that note would clarify into meaning. The actual experience was simpler and stranger. It felt like stopping. Like a very long walk ending not at a destination, but at the simple recognition that you have stopped walking and the ground beneath you is steady. The costs were something I had been carrying long enough that I knew their weight without needing to calculate it. 142,000 people, across Earth's forces and the allied species of the Accord, from the first engagement to the last. The Volkai's victims before we intervened were counted in the millions. I did not allow myself to do the arithmetic of what the total would have been if we had not acted. That arithmetic leads to a place that does not help anyone. That evening I sat at my desk and read Owen's notebook from beginning to end. Every name, every entry, It took 4 hours because I did not rush any of them. Owen sat across from me and read along in silence, because I had asked him to be there and he had come without asking why, which was exactly the kind of person he was. When I read the last name, Owen closed his notebook and set it on the desk between us. "What do we do with it?" he asked. "Keep it formally, in the official record, physically in a case somewhere visible to anyone who wants to see it, not filed, not stored, shown." "That can be arranged," he said. We sat without speaking for a while. Through the viewport, the cold iron remnant of the consumed star turned in the light of its nearest neighbor. 3 weeks later, the council convened at Nexus Prime, all 41 signatory species, filling every seat. The chairs that represented civilizations permanently lost were marked rather than removed, a border of absence around the edges of what had survived. Councillor Heth of the Threnody had formally requested the role of speaker for the session, and the council had granted it. I had been surprised by this until I understood it. He had been the first, 12 years ago, to create the conditions for laughter in that chamber. He understood what he owed. He chose to pay it in public and on the record. 12 years ago, he said, with the steadiness that comes from a decision made well in advance of the moment it is needed, a young commander from a young civilization stood in this chamber and told us something true and difficult and necessary. We heard it. We chose not to act on it. The reasons behind that choice were numerous, and none of them were sufficient. I will not present them today as justifications. I will say only what is true and what the permanent record should carry. This council failed in its most fundamental responsibility, and the people of Lethara and Savar and every other lost system paid for that failure with everything they had. He looked across the chamber at me. "We are grateful," he said, "and we are sorry." I had prepared things to say for this moment. I had crossed all of them out. Owen had listened to my thinking about it, and then said simply that the most honest response was probably the shortest one. I stood. "We accept," I said, "both." The chamber did not respond with anything you could call celebration. What followed the end of something like this is not celebration. It is something quieter, an acknowledgement between people who have shared a very long difficulty that the difficulty is done, and that they can now look at each other across the distance of everything that happened and remain in the same room and speak. A journalist found me in the corridor outside the chamber and asked, with the directness that journalists deploy when they believe they are asking the important question, what I most wanted people to remember. I thought about it for long enough that she began to look uncertain. "Remember that we asked first," I said. "We stood in that chamber and we laid out everything we knew, and we asked for help and cooperation, not from pride. Because we understood that the problem was larger than any single civilization and that cooperation was the rational response. We asked, and they said no, and we went and acted without them, and eventually they joined us. Remember the asking. The asking tells you who we were before everything that came after it. It tells you we were not looking for a reason to stand separate. We were looking for a way to stand together, and when that way was closed to us, we found another one, and we held it open until everyone who wanted to come through it was able to." I went back to the ship. I sat at my desk in the quiet of my quarters with the viewport full of stars that were still there, and I opened my personal log, and I read the last entry, the one I had written on the night the war ended, one short line because I had been too tired for anything longer. I read it back. Then I added what needed to follow it. The full entry from beginning to end read this way. "We are the species that was told to wait its turn and decided, quietly and firmly and without apology, that the turn had come. The stars that burn tonight burn because we refuse to let them be extinguished alone. Remember that when they ask you what humanity is. We are the ones who showed up." I closed the log, I turned off the light, I went asleep. Outside, the stars held their places in the dark. Every one that was still there was one we had kept. That was enough. That was everything. In the weeks after the final engagement, the Allied fleet stayed together rather than dispersing immediately to home systems. No one ordered this. Commanders chose it independently because the moment required a kind of shared witnessing. We had reached this conclusion together. It should be acknowledged together. I visited every ship during those weeks, not on a formal inspection schedule. I walked aboard, ate with crews, asked how people were, and listened to what they said and what they did not. The Allied crews were different from ours in the ways you would expect, and similar in the ways that mattered most. The same exhaustion, the same quiet relief, the same particular difficulty of not quite knowing what to do with oneself when the thing that has organized one's life for years is finished. A Selhari engineer told me she had not thought, in any real way, about what came next, because thinking about what came next had always felt like presuming she would survive to see it. We always assumed we would get through it, I told her. You assumed that, she said. We were less certain. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The memorial registry was established 6 months after the end of the war, not a monument at any single location, because the losses had been spread across distances too vast for any one place to hold them. It was a searchable record, permanently maintained, containing the full name and complete service record of every person lost across all Allied species from the first engagement to the last. Owen's notebook was transcribed into it in full. The notebook itself was placed in a display case in the registry's administrative center, exactly as I had asked. The registry's first entry, above any names, was a single sentence agreed upon by representatives of all 41 signatory species. It read, "These are the people who held the line while the rest of us decided whether to help." I did not write that sentence. I would not have written it, because it names the failure too directly for my comfort, even now. But the species who crafted it insisted, and I came to understand why. Some truths need to be in the record plainly, without softening, because they are the truths that are most easily softened away and most important to preserve. The stars were still there. That was the whole of it. The stars were still there.